Although time has no bias and time is impartial, and although we all have the same amount of time, 24 hours, the number one dilemma for bivocational pastors is a lack of it. I guess to be more accurate, it's a perceived lack of time. What gets in the way to being more present to our congregations is time. What gets in the way to spending more time preparing for a sermon is time. What gets in the way to developing better systems for discipleship, leadership, and all the other ministries in our church is time. And this is because bivocational pastors always have something going on. I recognize that bi means two, but most bivocational pastors I know, myself including, are more like tri or quad vocational than anything, which really puts even more pressure on finding time to do everything. Add on to that the fact that pastoral ministry is by its nature never a part-time thing. No wonder the number one dilemma for bivocational pastors is a lack of time. About a year and a half ago, I became bivocational. I joined my church after moving down from Edmonton down to Nashville to be here with newchurches.com. And when I joined my church, my commitment really was just to be the best member, the type of member that I always wanted as a pastor. So we joined the church in our neighborhood and started serving and did the membership class, joined a life group. Eventually our life group leaders left and the pastor asked, "Hey, can you lead the life group?" And I was like, "Yes, I can totally do it with my wife." And just started serving. And they were like, "Hey, can you share your testimony on stage?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'd love to." And then they're like, "Hey, can you preach for us?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course, I'd love to do that." And then a couple months later, they're like, "Can you preach again?" And they just kept on asking. And eventually they were like, "Hey, can you just be one of our teaching pastors?" So a year and a half ago, I became a teaching pastor at my church, and I preach probably about every other week, sometimes once every 3 weeks, and I love it. I mean, I love it because I'm a pastor, and I just love preaching to the same congregation over and over again, to my church, to my home church. Now, as I started doing this, and as I started preaching, well, as you know, I just finished my second book, No Silver Bullets, and I was trying to juggle writing at night, preparing for messages at night, because it's not my full-time job here at Lifeway, and then I have 3 young children as well, and a wife that I want to stay happily married to as well. So I had a lot of things that I was juggling, and onto that, the travel and the consulting that I do with new churches and with Lifeway leadership. It's been crazy, and as you know, we don't pastor for the money. We do it because of a sense of calling. Now, when I was a full-time pastor, I had at least 20 hours a week to prepare a sermon. It was during the day, during office hours, and during what was really my full-time job. And when preaching, and I remember when I was full-time pastoring, when I was preparing a message for that week, and when preaching, I mean, I always obviously started with the Greek and Hebrew, right? I mean, we all have to do that, right? And obviously, you know, it takes time to parse and translate. And after that, you obviously need to outline and write out the sermon before even consulting any commentaries. And then after you finish the entire sermon, then and only then you're able to consult commentaries, right? And to beef up the sermon. But it's not just one. You have to find at least 5 commentaries, if not 10 books and commentaries you have to comb through. And then after that, we have to commit the sermon to memory, right? Because that enhances delivery. I mean, isn't that what everyone does? I mean, well, at least that's how I was trained during seminary to preach. After all, isn't preaching the most important thing about church? And doesn't your attendance rise and fall on the quality of preaching alone? Well, if you haven't already got it by the tone of my voice, all of these myths, issues, challenges, and thoughts are things that I had to wrestle with when I accepted the task of being a bivocational pastor. Is the sermon as important as we make it out to be? Is it the silver bullet to ministry and church growth? Do I really need to spend 20 hours preparing a sermon for it to be biblically faithful and God-honoring? Is consulting 5 to 10 commentaries a necessity? And is the only way to do exegesis through the original languages? Do I need to memorize a sermon for it to be effective? The fact is, with a full-time job, 3 young children, and a wife that I love and want to stay happily married to, and the writing that I do, I simply don't have an extra 20 hours a week to prepare a sermon a couple times a month. I wish I had more time, but I just simply don't. So what do? Well, I'll tell you my regular rhythm here. This Sunday before I preach, I read through the passage that I'll be preaching from the following week and begin praying through it and mulling over it until Monday evening. Monday night, after I put my children to bed, it's typically around 8 to 8:30 p.m., and that's when I begin outlining the sermon, the main points and the introduction. By around 10 to 10:30 at night, I'm consulting my first commentary to make sure that I'm on track and I've understood and interpreted the passage appropriately, and then get ready for bed around 11 p.m. So on Tuesday after 8:30 p.m. or Wednesday after 9:30, since we have life group, I then manuscript 80 to 90% of the sermon out. I then send the main points over to our administrator to prepare the slides for Sunday. The rest of the week, I'm obviously praying for my congregation and through the sermon, but that's when it really comes to mind when driving or at night. So on Sunday morning, that's when I return to the sermon at around 7 a.m., finish it off, pray through it until 9. So in total, it's less than 8 hours of desk time. Obviously more if you count the moments I'm praying through the passage and mulling over it. I wish I could consult more commentaries and books, but I've had to limit myself to 3 at the max. Okay, so if this is the way that I preach, and I'm devoting more time to it as I wish I could, how can I get better as a preacher? While this module is not on preaching, the underlying question is, with the lack of time, we often only get done what we can get done the fastest we can do it. So if that's the case, how can we get better in our roles? How can we be developing ourselves in an ongoing manner as bivocational pastors? After all, aren't leaders learners? Aren't leaders readers? But who has the time for all that? During the rest of our time together, I want to address 2 audiences and what ongoing development looks like for, number 1, those who have formal theological education, and number 2, those who don't. Now, before we get there, let me share with you something called the 70-20-10 principle. And I'll explain it by continuing our example about preaching and how to become a better preacher. Okay, so for our Plus members at new churches, every month they have the opportunity to ask experts and thought leaders in the ministry world about their own questions about that month's particular topic. So this one month we had Matt Chandler on to answer questions about preaching. Now, as he was sharing his weekly rhythm for preaching, he mentioned this book, all right, this particular book. It was called Fool's Talk by Os Guinness, and he was reading it for ongoing development. Well, since Matt Chandler is such a gifted preacher, I immediately went out, literally, while he was, okay, maybe not while the webinar was going on, but right after, I went out, got the book, because, come on, if Chandler is learning from that guy, who am I not to do the same? Now, I wish I could have told you that I read that book immediately. I started it, but I've not yet finished it. To be completely transparent with you, I think I'm only 2 chapters in, and that interview was over a year ago. That's the dilemma that we as bivocational pastors have. We make time to do the urgent, but the thing that often gets neglected is ongoing development. Because who has time for that? Right? Who has time for that? Now, in my book, No Silver Bullets, 5 Small Shifts That Will Transform Your Ministry, I have a chapter entitled From Sage to Guide. In this chapter, I unpack what it looks like to move from being a sage on the stage to a guide on the side when it comes to discipleship and leadership development. There's this concept in this chapter that I'd like to share with you. It's called the 70-20-10 principle. This principle originated with Dr. Alan Tuff in his book, The Adults Learning Projects, and has since been elaborated and expanded by many others. This principle states that 70% of our learning comes by doing. Okay, so this is informal, on-the-job development that comes through trial and error, growing in experience. So like when we're preaching or when we're discipling others or when we're teaching a class, it's learning that comes by doing. Okay, so that's 70%. The next 20% of our learning is through receiving informal feedback from others. So maybe it's through formal coaching or mentoring relationships. This is primarily development that comes through interacting with others. This is about getting feedback and then improving through that. The last 10% of our learning comes through conferences, seminars, and courses. This is structured, formal education. So my questions for you are number one, is this true for you? Why do you preach the way you preach? Why do you disciple the way you disciple? Why do you lead the way that you lead? Is it because you're following the steps outlined in a textbook or from a course? Is it because someone coached you? Or is it because you've done it over and over again and learned what works and what doesn't through trial and error? Well, most likely it's a combination of all three, right? 70, 20, 10. But according to this principle, one of the most significant ways to develop is just by doing it. Now, I'm not talking about swinging the pendulum the whole other way, doing something without actively seeking out feedback, coaching, and new perspective through conferences, seminars, or courses is unwise. And that's why it's not the 100-0-0 principle. All that to say, if you want to develop in an ongoing manner, don't just relegate development to formal education. Think of the 70-20-10 principle. Okay, so let's now address those of you who have a formal theological education. As a bivocational pastor, how can you develop in an ongoing manner? Well, I'm in this bucket, and I've realized that if I'm not reading, I'm not learning. And if I'm not learning, I'm not growing. And if I'm not growing, I have no right to be leading. So reading and learning are the gasoline to my car. I've discovered that the more I'm reading and learning, the further I can go in life and the better that I can come up with ideas and strategies to implement and execute them. Francis Bacon once said, some books are to be tested, others to be swallowed, some few to be chewed and digested. Richard Steele once said, reading is to the mind what exercise is to the body. Mark Twain said, a person who won't read has no advantage over one who can't read. And William Godwin was quoted to have said, I love this, he that loves reading has everything within his reach. The one technique to reading that I've discovered is to never read just one book at a time. The greatest innovations in history have often resulted when seemingly disparate ideas from different disciplines are brought together. And that's why I'm always challenging myself to read from different disciplines all at the same time. So at any given time, I'm always working through at least 5 books, not randomly, but in an intentional manner. And each book is a part of a separate category. Okay, so for example, in my leadership category, I'm working through Ram Charan's The High Potential Leader. Here at Lifeway Leadership, we love his book, The Leadership Pipeline, and this is a new book for him. Okay. In the category strategy, I'm working through Conversion Code. In productivity, I'm working through John Wooden's book about quotes. And in my marriage parenting category, I'm working through Instructing a Child's Heart. And in my faith category, unfortunately, I'm still trying to work through that preaching book by Oskinus. I will finish it one day, and I'm not reading it because it's not good, but it's time, right? It's time. So what does it look like for you to read broadly and widely? And what areas do you feel like you need ongoing development in? And what areas are crucial for you to continue developing in as a leader? Now let's define reading. Not every book deserves to be read word for word. There's a book about this. It's called How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. I'd encourage you to check it out or look for a summary about it on the internet. But consider the ways that you can read, right, in the in-between moments of your day. You can listen to audiobooks while driving, read 15 minutes before you go to bed, or before the kids wake up, or maybe even on a Sunday afternoon. Redeem those moments when it's so easy to just turn on social media and see what's new. Instead, spend time reading and learning. Podcasts are another fantastic way to learn in those in-between moments, like when mowing the lawn or vacuuming the house. There's about 10 that I regularly listen to. So I just open up my podcast app, and obviously I listen to the New Church's Q&A podcast. I'm sure you're familiar of that. But the 5 leadership questions is another one that I co-host, and it's one of the ones part of Lifeway Leadership. the Entree Leadership Podcast I listen to, Freakonomics Radio, How I Built This. If you haven't heard about that one by NPR, it's fascinating, and I'm sure you especially would be interested in this because it's stories about how people started companies, how entrepreneurs started businesses. Rayner on leadership, our president at Lifeway, Dr. Rayner, has that one. Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell is a solid one. He's in his second season at the time of this recording. TED Talks. Tell Me Something I Don't Know is if you know StrengthsFinder, I'm a learner. I've intellection, I have input, and I just love learning different things. And it's a game show. It's a game show about just random ideas and what you can learn from that. There's a bunch of sermons, preachers that I listen to. B&H Publishing has a podcast called Word Matters. Trevin Wax and Brandon Smith do that, and they actually take the toughest passages in Scripture and break it out. What else? Pastor Talk by Lifeway Pastors. Unthinkable Leaders by friend Ronnie Wardwell. I was just on his podcast yesterday night, and it's a brand new podcast. He's just coming out with it. EST for the Established Church. My friend Micah Fries, Sam Rayner, and Josh King lead that one. The Craig Groeschel Leadership Podcast. The Carey Nieuwhof one. I mean, there's so many podcasts on my phone that I listen to because it's just in those in-between moments, right? Literally, mowing the lawn takes me about an hour. I listen at 1.5 speed because I just want to get through it super fast. And really, I go through and I probably listen to about 3 or 4 podcasts. And when I drive home in the morning, when I'm driving to work, I'm praying through the sermon. I'm praying for my church. I'm praying for my day. I'm praying for my family. But when I drive home, I'm always listening to a couple podcasts or an audiobook. So think about these moments, right, that you can redeem in order to develop in an ongoing way. Now, let's now talk about if you don't have any formal theological education. Okay, well, first of all, everything I've said up until this point applies to you as well, but we do have to think through the implications of a formal degree. A formal degree from an accredited seminary is an endorsement. Okay, it's obviously more than just an endorsement. My seminary education was a wonderful experience that, I'm not just saying this, I really wouldn't trade it for anything else in the world. But in a practical sense, aside from all the learning that you do, a seminary degree is an endorsement that you meet their minimum standards. It's an endorsement theologically, but most of all, it's an endorsement that means a lot when you're interacting with people who don't have a relationship with you. So formal degrees are important to get in the door with a particular church, network, or denomination, especially when there's no relationship. It's those things that open up the doors for you. Now, formal degrees obviously don't tell you anything about a person's character, which is why relationships are so important, but it does tell you a lot about what they know and their theological framework. However, if you're already pastoring and want to continue pouring in and investing where you're at and you don't have a formal degree, then it's not as important. In either case, if you don't have a theological degree, my formal recommendation, my recommendation to you is that you do pursue getting one, okay? Do it part-time. If you're already in a context serving bivocationally at your church and you have a full-time job elsewhere, pursue it online, pursue it part-time, especially if you don't have a seminary nearby. The whole idea of online is just so that you don't have to leave your context. If you have a great seminary in your neighborhood, you are blessed, but you are in the minority. Now, there are a ton of options these days online. But if you do choose to do it online, all right, I did mine both on campus and online. If you do it online, look for degrees that have a cohort format, all right? The cohort format is really important if you're doing it online. The cohort format, what that allows you to do is actually develop there's going to be a greater sense of accountability because you're going to be journeying with the same people over a couple of years. All right, so think about it like this. The advantage of going to seminary on campus is that you're developing relationships with professors, you're developing relationships with other students, and when you're at seminary, a lot of the things that professors talk about is, hey, you're never gonna get an intensive 3-year experience where you can study and develop friendships. And the friendships and the students that you're studying with, these are gonna be your ministry partners and friends for your entire 40, 50, 60 years. Even when I'm young, right? I have 3 kids, been married for about 11 years, but I recognize that I'm young. I see guys who are like in their 50s and their 60s, and I see who they're doing ministry together with. And a lot of times it's people they did seminary with, or people they've been friends or ministry partners, or maybe they've been pastoring in the same city or same context, same role for 20, 30 years, and they're in leadership positions organizationally. And who do they hire? They're hiring the people that they trust. They're hiring the people that they have relationships with. And obviously, sometimes they bring in outsiders, but that's probably more the exception than the norm. But these are the people that they know, that they trust, that they have relationships with. They're not saying, oh, where did you get your seminary degree from again? Because they've been pastoring faithfully, have strong character for the last 20 to 30 years. So that's what people from the seminary, that's what people would say and be like, this is why you need to go on campus. And those who say, and they'll say to the online side, hey, but where are those relationships going to be? You're missing out that key component. So what I then say to that is, if you're going to do online, it's great if you have a seminary in your neighborhood. But if you're going to do online, look for cohort format programs so that during the 2 years, 1, 2, 3 years that you're doing your online, even longer, you are constantly having the same conversations and interaction with the same people over the course of your degree. And that's going to be the same thing as if you were on campus. Okay, so look for hybrid programs, look for different options, but most of all, if you are bivocational and you don't have a seminary degree and you are already serving in your context, do it part-time. I mean, personally, I did my seminary degree. It took me 8 years to get mine done because I did it part-time. Because one of my values was I want to be fully in ministry so that every course I'm doing, yes, I'm doing it at a slower pace, but I remember my undergraduate education, there's a lot that I don't remember. Right, I remember doing it, but I don't really remember what I studied because I was like full-time. All I did was cram and write papers. Whereas in my seminary education, I can remember every single course I did and what I learned from each of the courses because I did it part-time. So that's my formal recommendation, that if you don't have a seminary degree, that you do pursue getting one. But regardless, right, regardless of whether you have a theological degree or not, you're bivocational. Right? Regardless of your next steps in each of those camps, we always need to be focusing on ongoing learning. Okay, so regardless of your education, ongoing learning is key. So what's your development plan? Time is the number one issue. A lack of time is the number one issue. But as we have talked through in this entire module, ongoing development is key. Right? You need to be learning, you need to be reading, you need to be growing. So what is your ongoing development plan, and how are you going to actually do that with others and help others along the way?